The bucket slipped from Alara's fingers before she could catch it, and cold, dirty water spread across the stone floor she had already scrubbed twice that morning. She stood there for 1 second, watching it happen, and then she picked the bucket up, wrung her cloth, and started again. That was her life inside Black Moon Manor. You spill something, you clean it. You get knocked down, you stand back up. You keep your head low, your mouth shut, and your eyes away from anyone who could hurt you. She had been doing exactly that for 3 years, and she was still alive. That, she told herself on the worst days, was enough. The manor was enormous. It had 34 rooms on 4 floors, and Alara knew every corner of it because she had cleaned every corner of it. She knew which floorboard creaked near the east staircase, which window latch was loose on the second landing, and which hallway was never used after dark because the head warrior, a broad man named Conrad, claimed it smelled like old blood and made his wolf nervous. She never told Conrad that it smelled like old blood because someone had stored hunting game there 2 winters ago, and the smell had soaked into the wood. She never said anything unnecessary. That was another rule she lived by. The Black Moon Pack was not cruel by accident. They were cruel by habit, the way people become cruel when no one ever holds them to account for it. The warriors lounging in the great hall would knock a tray from a servant's hands for the entertainment of it. The kitchen maids whispered about which wolves had bad tempers and which hallways to avoid after the evening meal. Alara had walked into this place knowing none of that, and she had learned it all quickly, the hard way, the way every servant in Black Moon Manor learned everything. She had her rules she never explained to anyone, because to explain them was to invite questions, and questions led to answers, and answers were the one thing she could never give. She never met a wolf's eyes directly. She knew what a direct gaze meant among their kind, and she could not risk the recognition it sometimes triggered in the older ones, the ones who had lived long enough to remember things the younger generation had forgotten. She kept her left shoulder covered at all times, regardless of heat or season. A loose-fitting linen shirt under her uniform, a cloth tied at her wrist when the collar slipped. Nobody had ever questioned it. Servants were invisible, and invisible people were allowed their small, unexplained habits. She never went outside on the 3 nights of the full moon. She claimed illness, claimed chores, claimed anything plausible. So far, it had worked. And she never, under any circumstances, let her temper fully surface. That last rule was the hardest one. She was refilling a water jug in the corridor near the main dining hall when she heard the gates open. The sound rippled through the manor the way sound always changed when something significant arrived. Boots on stone, the clink of gear, low voices carrying the specific flat tone of men who had been traveling too long and sleeping too little. She pressed herself against the wall and kept moving, jug in hand, head down. Alpha Kale Blackwood had returned from the border. She had never seen him before. He had been gone since before she arrived at the manor, handling a territorial conflict with a neighboring pack that had apparently stretched from weeks into months. The servants had talked about him in the way people talk about storms on the horizon, with a mixture of dread and strange admiration. He was 29. He had taken the Alpha title at 22 after his father's death, and had not lost a single challenge since. He was not known for warmth. Alara rounded the corner near the dining hall entrance and stopped. He was standing in the middle of the hall, still in his travel coat, and the entire room had rearranged itself around him, the way rooms do around people who carry genuine authority. He was taller than she had imagined, darker-haired, with the kind of tired in his face that comes not from sleep deprivation, but from the specific weight of making hard decisions repeatedly over a long period of time. He was speaking to Conrad in a low voice, not looking around, not performing his own arrival the way lesser men did. Then someone behind Alara shoved past her without looking, and the water jug lurched sideways in her grip. She caught it, barely. A small splash hit the floor, nothing more. She exhaled and turned to step back the way she had come. "You!" The voice belonged to Serafina Vane, and it turned Alara's stomach in the particular way that only Serafina's voice could. She was standing near the long dining table in a pale dress that cost more than Alara earned in 6 months, and she was pointing at her with one ringed finger. "I have been waiting 20 minutes for that water. 20 minutes. Alara walked to the table, set the jug down carefully, and said nothing. "Do you understand how incompetent you are?" Serafina's voice was not raised. She preferred a low, cutting tone, which was somehow worse than shouting, Every single task I give you takes 3 times as long as it should. I genuinely cannot fathom why you are still employed in this house. I apologize for the delay, Ilara said, her voice flat and controlled. Apologize? Serafina repeated the word, as if it were a foreign object she was turning over in her hand. Pour the water. Ilara poured the water. She did not see Serafina move. One moment her hand was steady around the jug, and the next moment Serafina's palm cracked across the side of her face, so suddenly and so hard that the sound of it rang off the stone walls before Ilara's mind had fully registered what had happened. The jug slipped. Water ran across the tablecloth in a wide, spreading stain. Now look what you have done, Serafina said. The hall had gone very quiet. Ilara straightened slowly. Her cheek burned. Her eyes had dropped to the floor automatically, an old survival instinct, and she kept them there while she breathed. In and out, steady and measured, the way she had practiced 1,000 times. Something moved beneath her ribs, old and large, and very, very awake, and she pressed it back down with the practiced force of someone who had been pressing it down for 15 years. Not now, not ever, not here. She reached for the jug to set it upright. Leave it! That voice was not Serafina's. It came from across the room, and it carried the particular quality of a voice that had never once in its life needed to raise itself to be obeyed. Ilara did not look up, but she heard footsteps crossing the stone floor, deliberate and unhurried. That is enough, Cale Blackwood said, and though he said it to Serafina, and not to Ilara, the words landed somewhere near the center of Ilara's chest, with a strange weight she did not expect. There was a pause. She spilled the water, Serafina said. Her voice had changed, softened into something almost reasonable, the way it always did when she was performing for an audience she cared about. She poured the water you asked for, and you knocked it from her hand, said a voice Ilara did not recognize, somewhere to the left. She risked a glance and saw a young man, one of the returning warriors, who looked immediately like he wished he had not spoken. Serafina's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes went cold. Cale said nothing further. He simply turned and walked away, back toward Conrad, and that was that. No punishment, no command, no scene. Just the conversation ending because he had decided it was over. Ilara cleaned up the water. She kept her face completely still. She took the soiled cloth to the laundry, rinsed the jug, and returned to her other tasks, moving through the manor, the way water moves through pipes, through the path of least resistance, touching nothing that she did not need to touch, drawing no attention. She was almost to the servants' staircase when the large gray wolf appeared at the top of the steps. She froze. It was not a dog. It was not even close to a dog. It was Cale's werewolf. She recognized it from the description the kitchen staff had whispered about with wide eyes. Silver gray, enormous, with pale yellow eyes and a temperament that had reportedly sent 3 experienced warriors backward over a bench last spring, when they startled it during a transition. It was sitting on the top step now, regarding her with an expression that wolves should not technically be able to have, something thoughtful and alert, as though it was reading her in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. Every instinct in Ilara's body told her to stop moving. She stood completely still. She did not run. She did not show her throat. She did not step back. She simply stood, breathing evenly, and looked slightly to the side of the wolf, the way one might look slightly to the side of something very bright. After a long moment, the wolf lowered its enormous head. Not aggressively, not as a threat. It lowered its head the way a very old, very well-trained soldier lowers his head when he recognizes someone who outranks him. Ilara walked carefully up the stairs and past it without touching it, and she did not look back. She did not sleep well that night. She lay on her narrow bed in the small servants' room she shared with no one, because no one had ever wanted to share a room with the quiet girl, who kept strange hours and covered her left shoulder, even on the warmest nights, and she stared at the ceiling and counted her breaths. Elder Oren had been in that dining hall. She had not noticed him at first. He was old, white-haired, small in the way of people whose presence is no longer dependent on physical size. He sat near the back, at the edge of the older wolves who had gathered to welcome the Alpha home. She had not looked at him, could not afford to look at anyone, but she had felt him looking at her, the way you feel a hand hovering an inch above your skin without touching it. He had been there when the water spilled. He had been there when Serafina struck her, He had been there when she straightened, breathed, and controlled the thing inside her chest. And when she had finally allowed herself one single glance across the room, just before she left with the soiled cloth, she had seen it. Elder Oren had dropped his cup. It lay on the stone floor in a small puddle, and he was staring at her with an expression she recognized with a cold, sinking certainty somewhere deep in her bones. It was not surprise. It was not confusion. It was recognition. She pressed her left shoulder into the mattress and pulled the blanket to her chin and made herself breathe slowly until her heart stopped hammering. She had been so careful. 3 years, and she had been so careful. She did not know how much time she had left before careful stopped being enough. The morning after Cale returned, Black Moon Manor did not feel like the same place. It was not something Alara could point to directly. The furniture had not moved. The corridors were the same length. The windows let in the same pale morning light. The kitchen smelled the same as it always had. But the air had changed, thickened somehow, the way air changes before a storm settles in. People moved differently. The warriors stood straighter. The senior staff spoke more quietly. Even the younger servants, who had grown casual in the Alpha's long absence, straightened their backs and stopped leaning against walls when they rested. Alara noticed all of it and adjusted accordingly. She arrived earlier to her first tasks, worked more efficiently, made herself even smaller inside the routines of the manor than she already was. Invisible was good. Invisible was safe. But something had shifted for her too, in a way she did not entirely like. She kept thinking about the wolf on the stairs. She had worked very hard, over 3 years, to make peace with what she was. Not at peace with it in any comfortable sense, more the way a person makes peace with a serious injury, not forgetting it, not pretending it isn't there, but learning to move around it so carefully that it rarely flared up. She had an identity she wore in this place. Ilara, the maid. Quiet, unremarkable, steady. That identity had kept her alive, and she had no interest in threatening it. But the wolf had bowed its head. The gray wolf had bowed its enormous head to a servant girl on a staircase, and no one had seen it happen except her. She pushed the thought away and went to work. Her tasks that morning included restocking the upper guest rooms, which involved carrying linens up 3 flights of stairs, and cleaning the wide corridor on the 2nd floor that connected the Alpha's private wing to the main gallery. That corridor was ordinarily not on her assigned route, but Marta, the senior housekeeper, had sent her with a short nod and said only, "The hall off the gallery needs a second pass. Do it quietly." Marta never explained her decisions, and Alara had learned not to ask. She was on her 3rd trip down the corridor, cloth in hand, when she heard voices behind the half-open door of the room at the far end. She recognized Seraphina's voice immediately. The other voice was male, older, one of the pack elders, she thought, though she could not place it. She kept her pace steady and did not slow down to listen. She was not that kind of person. She had learned, early and permanently, that knowing too much in the wrong house was a faster way to lose your life than knowing too little. But the word that drifted through the gap in the door as she passed made her breath catch without meaning to. Moonshadow. She kept walking. She did not hesitate, did not pause, did not change her pace by a single step, but her heart moved inside her chest in a way that made her jaw tighten, and she turned the corner before she let herself exhale. It meant nothing. It could mean nothing. It was a pack name, possibly, a territory name, a family name she was not aware of. There were hundreds of explanations, and she was not going to lose 3 years of careful work over a word heard through a half-open door in a house where she had no business listening. She went back downstairs and asked Marta for a different assignment. Marta looked at her for a moment with the flat, assessing expression she used for everything from checking produce to evaluating character, and said, "Dining hall needs setting for the midday gathering. Go." The midday gathering was the first formal meal since the Alpha's return, and the dining hall was full by the time Alara had finished laying the 2nd table and begun on the 3rd. She worked from the far end of the room toward the entrance, moving around the gathering wolves with the long practice of someone who has learned to navigate groups of people who do not consider her part of the room. Cale Blackwood was at the head of the central table. He was not in travel clothes now. He had changed into the kind of simple, dark clothing that wealthy men wear when they want to look like they are not thinking about how they look. and he was leaning slightly forward in his chair, listening to Conrad with the focused expression of a man who had a great many things to get through and was working systematically through them. He did not look at the servants. He did not look at much that was not directly relevant to what he was doing. That, Ilara had already decided, was probably his most useful quality as far as she was concerned. Serafina arrived late, which was a pattern Ilara had noticed in the 2 weeks before Kale's return, and suspected was not accidental. She swept in through the main entrance with 2 of her companions close behind her, and took the seat to Kale's right, as though she had reserved it specifically, which she had. She wore deep blue, and her dark hair was arranged elaborately, and she smiled at Kale with the particular brightness of someone who has calculated exactly how bright a smile should be. Kale glanced at her, and returned to his conversation with Conrad. Serafina's smile did not change, but something in her posture shifted in a way Ilara recognized. She had seen it before, in the weeks the Alpha was absent, when Serafina discovered that something was not quite within her control. It made her unpredictable in small, dangerous ways. Ilara kept her head down and finished the 3rd table. She was reaching for the last set of cups when she felt it. It was subtle, barely a sensation, more of an awareness. The faint prickling at the back of her neck that she had trained herself to notice years ago, because it was always a warning. She had learned not to dismiss it. She looked up without meaning to, just a flicker of an upward glance, not at anyone specific. But her gaze crossed Elder Oren's across the length of the room, and the old man was watching her with the same expression he had worn the night before, the expression that was not surprise and not confusion, but recognition, and this time he did not look away. Ilara set the last cup down with a precise, careful hand. She gathered the linen she had used to carry them, tucked it over her arm, and walked out of the hall through the servants' entrance. She spent the next 4 hours doing the lowest, most repetitive tasks she could find. Scrubbing, carrying, folding, the kind of work that meant she was in the basement and the back corridors, and nowhere near any room where Elder Oren might be walking. By evening, she had almost convinced herself she was overreacting. Then Conrad found her in the laundry corridor and said, in the tone of someone delivering a piece of information they personally had no investment in, "Elder Oren is asking for a word with you." She looked at Conrad's face for a moment. He was not the cruelest man in the manor. He was not particularly kind either. He was simply large and practical and slightly bored. "With me," she said. "With you," he confirmed. She said she would go after finishing her current task, and he nodded and left. She stood still in the laundry corridor for a moment, listening to the quiet. Then she finished folding the stack of linens she had in her arms, placed them on the shelf, and went. Elder Oren was waiting for her in the small room off the library that the older pack members used for private meetings. It was a plain room, 2 chairs, a narrow window, shelves of old books with leather spines. He was standing when she came in, which surprised her, and he looked at her with that same expression, unwavering, and said nothing for long enough that the silence became uncomfortable. "You wanted to speak with me," Ilara said. "I did," he said. His voice was unhurried and soft, the way old voices sometimes are. Not weak, just settled. "Sit down, if you like." She remained standing. He nodded, as though this was the answer he had expected. "You have been here 3 years." "Yes? You have a particular way of moving," he said. "Of standing. Of holding a room without seeming to hold it. I noticed it the first day you arrived, actually. But I told myself it was coincidence. I am too old for coincidences now." Ilara said nothing. "Your left shoulder," he said, and her entire body went still. He did not reach for her. He did not move toward her at all. He simply sat down in one of the chairs and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the floor between them. "I knew your mother," he said quietly, "a long time ago. Before everything, she had a mark like yours, in exactly the same place. I saw it once, when she was young and careless the way the young and safe can afford to be." He paused. She was not careless for long. The room was very quiet. "You have the wrong person," Ilara said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of it. Oren looked up at her. "Do I?" She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, which was as long as she could afford to, without risking something she could not take back, and then she looked at the window. "I am a maid in this house." I clean floors and carry water and fold linens. That is all I am. And if you say otherwise to anyone, I will not be responsible for what I have to do next." The old man looked at her for a long time. "No," he said finally, and his voice was very gentle. "You will not be responsible for what others do next. That is what worries me, child." She left. She walked quickly, not quite running, back through the library, and into the corridor, and around the corner. And she stood in a quiet alcove behind the east staircase, and pressed her back against the stone, and breathed. "Not now." She told herself that firmly. Not now. Not here. In her small, solitary room that night, she lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the words she had heard through the half-open door that morning. Moonshadow. She thought about the wolf on the stairs. She thought about the old man who had known her mother. She thought about the rule she had kept for 15 years. The rule that said, be invisible, be small, survive. She had been surviving. She was very good at it. But something in the manner was shifting now, and she could feel it the way she could feel the approach of the full moon, even before the calendar told her it was coming. It was not a feeling she could ignore, no matter how carefully she tried. Something was moving toward her, and she did not yet know whether it was danger or something older and harder to name. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket close, and she pressed her left shoulder into the mattress, and she waited for sleep that was a long time in coming. 3 doors down the corridor, Serafina Vane sat in her large, well-furnished room and wrote a short note to her father in neat, careful handwriting. She sealed it with wax, pressed her ring into it, and set it aside for the morning courier. It was a note about nothing important, as far as anyone reading it could tell. But Serafina had learned, from her father, that the most important messages never look like important messages. She blew out the lamp and listened to the manor settle into the quiet of deep night, and she smiled to herself in the dark for reasons she kept entirely to herself. 2 floors below, Elder Oren sat at his desk with a candle burning low and an old book open to a page he had not read yet, but was not ready to close. He sat there for a long time, looking not at the page but at the small flame, and the expression on his face was one that people who love someone feel when they realize they may not be able to protect that person from what is already coming toward them. He turned the page. He began to read. The note Serafina had sent to her father arrived at the Vane estate 2 days later, and whatever it said produced results faster than Alara could have anticipated, though she did not yet know the note existed. What she knew was that the atmosphere in Black Moon Manor had changed again, subtly, the way pressure changes before weather turns. Serafina's companions moved through the corridors with a new energy, bright and sharp-edged. The senior staff walked more carefully around Serafina than usual, which was notable because they already walked carefully around her. And Alara found that the tasks she was being assigned were increasingly centered around rooms and times that placed her directly in Serafina's orbit. She thought about requesting a reassignment from Marta, and then decided against it. Requesting anything that looked like avoidance invited questions, and questions were still the thing she could least afford. So she worked. She laid tables and poured tea and carried messages and scrubbed tiles, and she watched the shifts in the manor the way she watched everything, with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that the world always tells you what it is about to do if you pay close enough attention. Cale Blackwood was everywhere and nowhere. She saw him in the corridors, at the long table during meals, crossing the courtyard in the early mornings, with Conrad close behind. He moved through his own house, like someone who was comfortable with authority, without being comfortable in the conventional sense. He rarely smiled. He was not cold exactly, more contained, the way a room is contained when every window is closed. She got the impression he was a man running through the mechanics of leadership with discipline and intelligence, while something else in him ran quietly alongside it, unacknowledged, separate. She was not supposed to be forming impressions of the alpha. That was the kind of noticing she could not afford. She stopped forming impressions of the alpha. She was carrying a tray of tea service to the small parlor on the first floor, 5 days after his return, when the wolf appeared again. Not at the top of the stairs this time. In the corridor outside the parlor, sitting with the particular stillness of an animal who had been waiting and was content to keep waiting for exactly as long as necessary. Its pale eyes followed her as she approached, and it rose to all 4 feet as she neared the door. Alara stopped. The tray was balanced in her hands. She kept her breathing even. The wolf turned its head slightly, in the direction of the parlor entrance, and then looked back at her, with an expression that she told herself she was absolutely imagining. She was not imagining it. She had known wolves all her life. She had grown up around them in the only time in her life when she had not needed to pretend, and she understood their language the way she understood the language of weather or water. This particular wolf was not blocking the door. It was standing slightly to the side of it. It was watching her with steady, clear attention, and it had turned its head toward the entrance and back to her in the way that meant, with a specificity that she could not pretend was ambiguous, something like, "In there." She took a slow breath. She went into the parlor. The parlor was not empty. Cale Blackwood was standing near the window on the far side of the room, his back partially to her, looking out into the courtyard below. He did not turn when she entered. "I asked for the tea an hour ago," he said. His voice was not angry, just flat. "I apologize. There was a delay in the kitchen." She set the tray on the small table in the center of the room and began pouring, without being asked, because if there was one thing she had become efficient at in 3 years, it was the geometry of tea service. He turned from the window. She kept her gaze on the tray and the cup. "You have been in this house 3 years," he said. Her hands did not pause. "Yes. You came from the south." It was not quite a question. "A small village." "Yes." A silence opened between them that had the particular texture of a silence between two people, where one of them is deciding something. "You settled res," he said. She looked up before she could stop herself, because that was not a sentence she had been prepared for. Res was the wolf's name. She had not known she knew this, but the name landed in her the way a familiar word does when you hear it after a long time, not new, simply returned. Cale was watching her, with an expression she could not entirely read. "No one settles him," he said. "Not my senior warriors, not the trainers who have worked with him for 4 years. He settled for you on a staircase." He paused. "Why?" She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then dropped her eyes back to the tea. "I don't know," she said. "Animals sometimes take to me." "Not this one." She placed the cup carefully on the tray. "I have no other explanation to offer." Another silence. "Conrad tells me Serafina struck you in the dining hall the night I arrived," he said. She said nothing. "I want you to tell me if it happens again," he said. She almost said, "It will not happen again, because I will be more careful." But she caught herself. That would be the wrong answer in too many ways. Instead, she said, "Yes, Alpha," in the flat, respectful tone she used for all authority, and waited. He looked at her for a moment longer. She could feel it without looking up, the quality of his attention, which was different from most people's in that it was entirely unperformed. He was not looking at her to seem powerful, or to make her uncomfortable, or for any reason that was about himself. He was simply looking at her because something did not add up, and he was a man who followed unresolved questions until they resolved. She was very, very careful not to be interesting to men who followed unresolved questions. "That's all," he said. She took the tray and left. In the corridor, Rez was no longer there. She stood for a moment in the empty hallway and collected herself and walked very deliberately back toward the kitchen, and she told herself that the conversation had been nothing, that it meant nothing, that she had given nothing away. She almost believed it. Serafina found her 3 hours later in the upper corridor, which was not somewhere Serafina usually walked unless she had a purpose for being there. She had a purpose. "I need you to go to my rooms," Serafina said, "and bring me the silver necklace from the box on my dressing table, the one with the pale blue stone." Alara went. She found the box, found the necklace, and returned it within 7 minutes, which was fast by any reasonable standard. She held it out on her palm. Serafina looked at it, and then looked at her with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and completely empty of warmth. "That is not the right one," she said. Alara looked at the necklace. There had been only one with a pale blue stone. "I can look again," she said. "You do that." Serafina turned and walked away. Alara went back. She looked through the box carefully, thoroughly, and found nothing she had not already found. She returned and told Serafina so. Serafina said, How strange, and walked away again. 2 days after that, Ilara came back to her room at the end of a long shift and found Marta standing outside her door with an expression that was uncomfortable in the specific way of someone delivering news they have been instructed to deliver and personally dislike delivering. "There has been a complaint," Marta said. "An item is missing from Serafina's rooms. A ring. It belonged to the late Luna." Ilara looked at her. "I have never taken anything from this house." Marta said nothing. "Marta," Ilara said quietly. "I know," Marta said. "Just that. I know." And then she stepped aside from the door, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who is standing on the wrong side of something and is aware of it and cannot do anything about it. Not today. Not with the power she currently has. Ilara opened her door. On the small shelf beside her bed, next to her folded blanket and the single book she owned, there was a ring. Silver, old, set with a dark stone. It had not been there when she left that morning. It had not been there last night. It had never been there before. She looked at it for a long time. She did not touch it. "The gathering is in 4 days," Marta said from behind her. "The full moon gathering." A pause. She has already spoken to Conrad. 4 days. 3 nights of the full moon. And on the 4th day, a gathering of the entire pack, every wolf, every elder, out in the open under the open sky. Ilara stood in the doorway of her small room and looked at the ring on the shelf that someone had placed there to end her, and she understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, that her time of being invisible was almost over. She had 4 days to figure out what came next. In his room at the far end of the manor, Elder Oren was already writing by lamplight, his pen moving quickly, a letter addressed to someone whose name he had not spoken aloud in 12 years. His hands were not entirely steady, but they did not stop. On the morning of the 4th day, the sky was enormous and clear, the kind of sky that feels like an announcement. The air over Black Moon Manor carried a charge in it that was not quite weather, something older and more animal, the feeling that comes to a pack when the full moon is less than a day away. Wolves felt it in their blood. Even the humans in the manor felt it without quite knowing why, moving a little faster than usual, speaking a little less. Ilara moved through her morning tasks with the careful precision of someone who was fully aware they might be performing them for the last time. She had spent 4 days thinking. She had gone through every option she could find, turned them over the way you turn stones in a stream, looking for the one that held something underneath it. She had found nothing that changed the shape of what was coming. The ring had been found in her room. Serafina had made the accusation before witnesses. The late Luna's belongings were a matter of pack honor, which meant the accusation could not be quietly dismissed by anyone who valued their standing in the pack. Conrad had confirmed to Marta that the matter would be addressed at the gathering. And the gathering was tonight, outside, under the rising full moon. She could run. She had thought about this. She had possessions that could fit into one bag, and she knew the manor's exterior well enough to identify 2 points of exit that were not regularly patrolled. But running would mean abandoning 3 years of careful positioning, and more than that, it would mean running again. She had been running since she was 11 years old, and she was 26 now, and she was very, very tired of it. She could tell the truth. She had thought about this too, longer and harder. She had turned it over from every angle and found the same problem at the center of it every time. The truth was not a thing she could offer in pieces, and the whole truth was not something this pack was prepared for. The whole truth would not protect her. It would more likely destroy her before it helped her. Because the things the whole truth required, position, witnesses, proof, the right moment, were not assembled, and she could not assemble them in 4 days. And she had thought about the third option, which was not running and not explaining, but simply refusing to be what this house had always assumed she was. She had pressed that thought back down every time it surfaced. She pressed it down again now, firmly, while she laid the breakfast table and poured the morning tea and moved through the manor like water, like something with no shape of its own. Elder Oren passed her in the corridor near the library at mid-morning. He did not stop. He did not speak. But he pressed something into her hand as he walked past, so quickly and smoothly that only someone watching very closely would have caught it. She kept her fist closed around it until she was alone in the linen room, and then she opened her hand. It was a small piece of paper. On it, in the old man's careful, angular handwriting, was a single line. "You do not have to carry it alone tonight, but but you must decide what you are before they decide it for you. She stood in the linen room for a long moment. Then she folded the paper very small and tucked it inside her uniform, close to her chest, and went back to work. The gathering assembled at dusk. The pack's gathering space was a wide, flat area behind the east wing of the manor, surrounded on 3 sides by old trees and open to the sky on the 4th. It was used for ceremonies, for announcements, for the kinds of pack decisions that required the presence of everyone. It had a particular quality when it was full of wolves, a low, collective hum of energy that Alara had learned to feel through the soles of her shoes. She was brought out last, which was deliberate. Conrad came for her when the assembly was already gathered, when there was nowhere to look and nothing to focus on, except the assembled pack and the pale edge of the moon beginning to push above the tree line. She walked with him through the corridor and out through the east door and into the gathering space, and the crowd opened for her and then closed again behind her, and she stood in the middle of it all with her hands at her sides. Cale Blackwood stood at the front of the space on a slight rise. He was watching her approach with an expression that she could not read at this distance, and beside him, Seraphina stood in pale silver, composed and bright, like a woman attending a celebration. Conrad spoke the accusation aloud. He did it formally, without inflection, the way a practical man handles an unpleasant duty. Alara listened to him describe the late Luna's ring, the complaint, the item found in a servant's quarters, the tradition of pack justice that required a public accounting. The assembled wolves were quiet. Some of them watched Alara with curiosity, a few with something that looked like sympathy, most of them with the blank, waiting expression of people who have come to see a thing resolved. Cale said, "Do you dispute this?" Alara looked at him directly. She had nothing left to lose by looking at him directly. "The ring was placed in my room," she said. "I did not take it." A murmur moved through the crowd. Seraphina said, with great reasonableness, "The item was found. I make no judgment about how it came to be found, but it was found. Pack law is clear." Cale looked at Alara. She could see something working behind his eyes, something careful and specific, not cruelty, more like a man standing on a beam and calculating exactly how much weight was too much. "The sentence for theft from the Alpha's household," Conrad said, without being asked, "is 20 lashes under the full moon." She heard it land in the crowd around her. She heard the shifting, the small sounds. She kept her eyes on Cale's face. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. She counted them. His jaw moved slightly. He was going to give the order. She could see it forming in him the way weather forms, reluctantly but inevitably, because he was Alpha, and pack law was pack law, and he had not yet found the lever that would let him move around it without damaging something larger. He gave the order. 2 warriors moved to take her arms. The moon cleared the trees. The full moon did not rise gradually. It arrived. It was there, and then it was there, silver and enormous and immediate, and the light of it hit Alara across the shoulders and the face and the chest, like something physical, like a hand pressing in, finding her, the way it always found her on these nights, no matter how many walls she put between herself and the sky. She had been pressing back against it for 15 years, pressing the thing inside her flat, keeping it contained, holding herself small and quiet and manageable inside the shape of Alara the Maid. She had been very good at it. She was, she believed, the best in the world at it, because she had no choice, because the alternative had always felt like destruction. But she was also 26 years old, and she had been running since she was 11, and she had just been sentenced to 20 lashes for a crime a spoiled, calculating woman had invented to remove her from a house she no longer wanted her in. And she was standing under the full moon in the middle of a wolf pack, with 2 warriors holding her arms, and her left shoulder exposed, and the thing inside her chest had risen to meet the moonlight, before she could press it back down. "Wait," she said. Her voice came out differently than it usually did. It was the same word she always used, but the resonance under it was different. It had something old in it, something that had nothing to do with volume. The 2 warriors' hands loosened, before they had consciously decided to loosen them. She did not try to run. She stood very still, with the moonlight full on her face, and she felt the old thing rise, and she thought, with the last of the part of her that was still Alara the Maid pressing hard against it, "Not like this, please, not like this." And then Seraphina's voice cut through from the side, sharp and carrying. "Hold her, Stop letting servants give you orders. And one of the warriors, responding to that familiar voice, retightened his grip. And Alara felt the last of the wall come down. She heard her mother's voice then, the way she had heard it only in the deepest corners of memory for 15 years, clear and close, as though the woman were standing right beside her. When you can no longer kneel, my daughter, make the world kneel instead. She looked up. She looked at the assembled pack, at Conrad, at Seraphina, at Elder Oren, standing near the edge of the crowd, with his hands pressed together, and his eyes bright with something that looked like relief even through his fear. She looked at Cale Blackwood, who was watching her with an expression that had moved entirely past calculation into something open and unguarded and entirely unprepared for what was coming next. She opened her mouth. One word came out. It was not loud. It was not a shout. It moved through the air like something absolute, like a law of physics, and it was not precisely a wolf sound, and not precisely a human sound, but something older than either, something from the time before the distinction had mattered. It simply said, kneel. She did not throw power outward. She did not try to force anything. She simply stopped containing herself for one single moment and let what she actually was stand in the open air like a fact. The two warriors dropped to their knees. They did it before they knew they were doing it, before any conscious choice had moved through their bodies, because choice was not what was happening. It was older than choice. Conrad was on one knee before the sound had finished traveling the width of the gathering space. The crowd followed in a wave, not all at once, not evenly. The wave broke over different people at different speeds, but it broke over all of them. Every wolf, every elder, every warrior who had ever kicked a tray from a servant's hands or looked through a quiet woman in a corridor as though she was not entirely real. Seraphina hit the ground like a stone, and for the first time in Alara's memory, Seraphina Vane had absolutely nothing to say. Cale Blackwood was the last. She watched him. She watched him resist it the way she imagined he resisted everything that tried to push him down, with the full weight of a will that had been built over years of fighting and leading and refusing to yield. His face was extraordinary in those seconds, not afraid, more like a man who has just understood something that reorganizes everything he previously understood. Something in him that was purely wolf understood before his mind caught up. His knees touched the ground. The entire gathering space was silent. Elder Oren had not fallen. He was still standing. He was the only one standing. He was weeping, very quietly, with his hands pressed together and his eyes on Alara. He said it clearly, into the silence, in the old language first, and then in the common tongue, so that everyone could understand. Princess Alara, Moonshadow, last heir of the royal Lycan bloodline. He paused. The bloodline lives. The moonlight was very bright. Alara stood in the middle of the kneeling pack and looked at the sky and breathed. She was still Alara. She was exactly the same person she had been a moment ago. The world had not ended. She had not burned. Nothing had broken except the wall, and the wall, she understood now with a clarity that had the quality of cold water, had been hurting her for 15 years. She had built it to survive, and she had survived, and now the wall was down. She felt the thing inside her chest settle. Not disappear, settle, the way a wolf settles when it finally comes home. Far away, in the Bloodfang stronghold, a man with dark eyes and old blood on his hands felt the aura roll across the distance like a wave. His head came up sharply. The expression on his face was not fear, which would have been safer. It was the expression of a hunter who has just heard the sound he has been listening for across a very long time. Alpha Draven set down his cup. He smiled. So, the little princess survived, he said, to no one in particular. In the gathering space of Black Moon Manor, no one moved. No one rose. The whole world seemed to have paused on a single breath, waiting to see what happened next. Alara lowered her eyes from the sky and looked at the kneeling pack, and she understood that the most dangerous part of this night had not yet begun. The knees came up slowly, one by one, as the aura settled. Wolves rose from the ground with the dazed look of people who have just passed through something they did not have words for yet. Some of them looked at Alara with the specific blankness of minds still catching up to what their bodies had already understood. Some looked away. A few of the younger warriors looked at each other as though checking whether the other person had experienced the same thing they had. Conrad rose without expression and stood very still, the way a practical man stands when he is recalibrating. Cale Blackwood rose last. He straightened to his full height and looked at Alara across the open space of the gathering area with an expression that was, for the first time since his return, completely without the layer of controlled distance that he usually wore. What was underneath it was harder to name. Not anger, not awe exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of a man standing on ground that has just shifted beneath him and deciding in real time whether to run or to hold still. Serafina rose from the ground with less grace than she had ever in her life exhibited and stood with a composure that was visibly assembled from the outside in, her expression arranged quickly into something smooth and careful. But her eyes, when they found Alara, had changed. The calculating brightness was still there, but underneath it now was something colder and more specifically dangerous. This was a woman who had spent 20 lashes to remove a maid, and who had just learned the maid was not a maid. Alara saw it. She filed it away. She had no room for it right now. Elder Oren moved through the crowd toward her, and no one stopped him or stepped in his way, because the crowd was still absorbing, still settling into the new shape of things. He stopped at a respectable distance and looked at her with the same expression he had worn since the beginning, the expression that was recognition and something that looked very much like relief and also grief all at once. "You should come inside," he said quietly. She was going to agree. She was already turning when Cale's voice came from behind her, not raised, not sharp, simply placed into the air with the authority of a man who was still the alpha of this pack, regardless of what had just happened. Not yet. She turned to face him. He walked toward her slowly, and the crowd fell back around him by instinct, making a wide space between him and her that felt less like a confrontation and more like a stage clearing itself for something important. He stopped at a few feet of distance and looked at her with those unperformed eyes of his and said nothing for a moment. "Your name," he said finally. "Alara," she said. "Your full name." She looked at him steadily. "Alara Moonshadow." He absorbed this. "You have been in this house for 3 years. Yes. As a maid. Yes. A beat. Why?" It was such a simple question. It held so much inside it. She could see him trying to work through the arithmetic of it, and finding that the numbers did not add up into anything that made easy sense. And she understood why. Because they had not made easy sense to her either, not for a very long time. "Because it kept me alive," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way a practical man nods when he has received an honest answer to a direct question. "We will speak privately," he said. "Tonight." He glanced at Elder Oren. "You as well." Then he turned to the assembled pack and spoke in the flat-carrying voice he used for pack decisions. "This gathering is closed. The matter of the ring will be reinvestigated by Conrad, with full authority. Anyone who interferes with that investigation will answer to me directly." He did not look at Serafina when he said it. Serafina looked at no one. The gathering dispersed in the stunned, quiet way that significant events disperse. People moving away in small groups, speaking in low voices, not quite ready to speak in normal tones about anything that had just happened. Alara watched them go and felt something unfold in her chest that she did not entirely have a name for. Not comfort. Something earlier than comfort. Something more like the beginning of a breath she had been holding for 15 years. She went inside. Conrad's investigation was thorough and unemotional. By the following morning, he had established, through the testimony of 3 separate witnesses whose accounts had not been solicited together, that Serafina's personal maid had been seen in the east corridor near the servants' quarters on the afternoon the ring was reported missing. The ring itself, when examined by Elder Oren at Cale's request, was identified as not the late Luna's ring at all, but a similar piece from the Vane family collection, substituted with enough care to fool a casual eye, but not a careful one. Serafina, when confronted with this, was composure itself. She suggested the investigation was biased, that emotions were running high, that everyone was looking for someone to blame for an unprecedented and destabilizing event. She suggested this calmly, and with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime managing rooms and outcomes and had not yet decided to stop doing so. Cale listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he looked at Conrad and said, "Remove her from the manor." Serafina said, "You cannot." "Today," Cale said. "She left. Not permanently. Not yet. There were formalities to manage, pack law to satisfy, the Vane family standing to consider. But she left the manor that afternoon, in a carriage with 2 trunks and her 2 closest companions, and the gates closed behind her, and the manor breathed differently for the rest of the day. Alara felt it change. She was sitting in the library with Elder Oren when it happened, and the old man looked up from the papers on his desk and nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something he has been waiting on for a long time has finally begun to move in the right direction. They talked for 4 hours that day. She had not talked to anyone, not truly talked, for 3 years, and even before that her conversations had been shaped by caution and strategy, and the particular discipline of someone who knows that the wrong word to the wrong person could end everything. Talking to Oren was different. He had known her mother, he had known her family, he had been young when the Moonshadow line was still intact, had been present at the court during the years when the Lycan royal bloodline was still a functioning, visible thing in the world, rather than a whispered history. He told her things she had not known, things her nursemaid, the woman who had carried her out of the burning fortress, had not had the chance to tell her before she died. He told her that the Bloodfang attack had not been spontaneous, that the fortress gates had been opened from within, by someone who knew the layout, who knew the timing of the guard rotation, who knew which wolves would be positioned where that night, someone with access to that information, someone trusted. Who? She said. He looked at her for a moment. We did not know. At the time, there were too many losses, too much chaos, and the surviving witnesses scattered. But I have had 12 years to look at what remained. He folded his hands on the desk. The land that the Bloodfang pack gained after the attack, the territories they were able to claim without challenge because the royal line was assumed dead, were significant. But there were families who benefited in smaller ways from the shift in power. Families who had been positioned near the old court and found themselves holding new influence in the aftermath. Ilara looked at him. Gerald Vane, he said quietly, was the court liaison to the Northern Territories. He was at the fortress the week before the attack. He left 2 days before it happened, citing a family matter. He paused. The land his family now holds on the northern border was part of the old Moonshadow estate. The room was very quiet. He opened the gates, she said. I believe so. I cannot yet prove it entirely, but I believe so. She sat with this for a long time. Outside the library window, the manor was going about its ordinary afternoon business, and the sound of it was strange against the weight of what she was holding inside. She had known, in some abstract way, that the attack was planned. She had understood from a young age that someone had helped it happen. But knowing it abstractly was different from sitting in a library with a name and a face attached to the abstract knowledge, different from understanding that the woman who had struck her across the face in a dining hall 4 days ago was the daughter of the man who had murdered her family. She knew, Ilara said. Oren tilted his head slightly. That is less certain. What her father told her, and when, is something we do not know. She knew enough. Ilara thought of the note Seraphina had sent with the morning courier, which she had seen from the corridor window without understanding what it meant at the time. She sent word. When she realized, or when she started to suspect what I might be, she sent word. Oren looked at her sharply. To her father, Ilara said. Who would send word to Draven? The old man rose from his chair so quickly that it pushed back across the floor. He moved to the door with a speed that his age did not seem to limit, and called for Conrad with a voice that carried the authority of someone who had not always been old and quiet. Kale arrived within 10 minutes. Ilara explained it in plain, sequential terms, the way she had learned to communicate anything important, without drama, without embellishment, because the plain shape of it was dramatic enough. Oren added the evidence he had accumulated, the maps, the dates, the land records he had quietly compiled over 12 years, while telling himself he was simply keeping history. Kale listened to all of it without expression. He asked 3 questions, specific and precise, and received specific and precise answers, and then he looked at Conrad. Lock the outer gates, he said. Double the border patrols. Tonight. He looked at Ilara. Is there anything else I should know? She thought about it. Draven is not coming to negotiate, she said. He has been waiting 15 years to find out if the bloodline survived. Now he knows. He will come to finish what he started. How soon? He is not impulsive, she said. He is calculated. He will come when he thinks the timing is right, but he will come. Kale nodded. Then we will be ready. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same unperformed directness he had used since the beginning, and there was something in it now that had not been there before, or that had been there and she had not had permission to see it clearly. Something that was recognition, without quite having had all the information it needed to fully form. I owe you an apology, he said. She waited. For the gathering. For the order I gave. His voice was flat and direct, the way his voice always was. No performance in it. I did not know. That is not a complete excuse, but it is the truth. She looked at him for a moment. You stopped Serafina on the first night, she said. When she struck me. You had no reason to. He said nothing to this, which was its own kind of answer. She had managed for 3 years to remain entirely uninvested in Alpha Kale Blackwood as a person, and she had done it by keeping him firmly in the category of things she could not afford to think about directly. She was going to need to continue doing that. The situation was complicated enough without adding the disorienting business of recognizing that this man, who had ordered her punishment 48 hours ago, and was now looking at her with the exact quality of attention she would most need to not think about, was something other than simply the authority she had been navigating around. She would deal with that later. There is something I need to do, she said. Now? Before Draven arrives. However much time we have. She looked at Oren. I need to write to the other packs. The ones who were allied with my family before the attack. If they know the bloodline is alive, there are those who will come. Oren nodded slowly. There are those who will come, he agreed, and some who will not be glad of it. Then we write to the right ones first, she said. Kale looked at her across the table. You have done this before, he said. Not a question. Not quite. I grew up in a royal court, she said. Before the attack, I was being prepared to lead one day. I was 11 when it happened. She paused. I did not forget what I was taught. I just had no place to use it. Something moved across Kale's expression that she did not try to interpret. Use it now, he said. She did. The letters went out that evening, 7 of them, each carefully worded, each addressed to a specific alpha, or elder, whose name she pulled from a 15-year-old memory that turned out to be significantly more intact than she had assumed. Oren filled in the gaps where her memory had worn. Conrad dispatched the couriers with the specific instructions of a man who understood urgency without needing it explained. And late that night, after the letters were gone, and Oren had gone to bed, and Conrad had gone to his duties, Alara sat in the library in the low lamplight and felt the full weight of the day settle over her. She was still Alara. She was still the same person. She was not naive enough to believe the world had resolved itself because she had stopped containing the thing inside her chest for 60 seconds under a full moon. Gerald Vane was still alive and almost certainly informed. Draven was still out there, smiling in the dark somewhere, calculating his timing. The pack she was now visible to was still a pack that had watched her be struck across the face without intervening for 3 years. But the letters were gone. Oren was on her side, and the man who led this pack had listened to her in the library today with the attention of a man who intended to act on what he heard. She closed her eyes. She did not press anything down. She let herself feel the weight and the fear and the particular ache of being truly visible after 15 years of carefully chosen invisibility, and she breathed through it steadily, the way she had always breathed through hard things. When she opened her eyes, the lamp was still burning. She was still here. That, she thought, was still enough. For now. She was wrong about Draven's timing. She had assessed him as calculated, patient, a man who arranged his moves before he made them. That assessment was correct. What she had not accounted for was the specific calculation he had already completed by the time her name was spoken aloud in the Black Moon gathering space. He had been waiting 15 years for a signal. The signal had arrived. He was already moving. The first sign came from the border. 2 of the doubled patrol wolves returned at dawn 6 days after the gathering, not running, not in panic, but with the particular tightness in their faces of people delivering news they had hoped not to have to deliver. Conrad brought it to Kale, and Kale brought it to Alara, who was in the library again with Oren, because that had become the room where decisions were being made in the hours since everything changed. Bloodfang wolves. A group of them, 20 at minimum, stationary in the forest on the eastern boundary. Not attacking, not advancing, waiting. Oren said, He is testing the response time. Alara said, he is telling us he is already here. She had known, since the night of the gathering, that the danger was not abstract. She had been managing the knowledge of it the way she managed most difficult things, by keeping her attention on the practical and the immediate, and not letting herself look too long at the full shape of what was coming. But looking at Cale's face now, at Conrad's face, at Oren's, she understood that the full shape was arriving whether she looked at it or not. Have any of the allied packs responded? She asked. 2, Oren said. He picked up the letters that had arrived the previous evening. Each one she had been handed with the same held-breath quality of someone afraid of the answer. Aldrich Stone from the Greymount pack. He acknowledges the bloodline and pledges support. He can have 60 wolves here in 3 days. He set the first letter down. And Marin Ellis, from the Saltwood pack. She writes more carefully, but the answer is yes. 2 out of 7. With 60 wolves in 3 days, and Draven's forces on the border right now. Cale said. What do we have today? Conrad said. 112 capable fighters in this pack, counting the border patrol. And Draven? Based on what we know of Bloodfang's strength, Ilara said, and she spoke from memory, from things she had been told in a childhood she was not supposed to still have access to, between 200 and 240 wolves. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Cale said, what does he want? Everyone looked at Ilara. She had been thinking about this since the night of the gathering. She had been thinking about it in the careful, organized way that she had been taught to think about power, which was not the way most people thought about it. Most people thought about power in terms of who had it. She had been taught to think about it in terms of what it needed. He wants me dead, she said. That is the simple answer, and it is true. The Moonshadow bloodline is the only legitimate authority that can challenge his territorial claims. 15 years ago, he destroyed the family. He believed the line was extinct. He built everything he has since on that belief. As long as I am alive, everything he holds is contestable. Then we protect you, Cale said. That is not enough, she said. Protecting me just keeps the problem contained. He will wait, and then he will try again with more force, and eventually he will find a way. The only answer to Draven is exposure. She looked at Oren. We need the allied packs not just for fighters, but for witnesses. If the truth of what he did to my family, the evidence of the gates being opened, Gerald Vane's involvement, comes out in front of enough pack leaders, Draven's position becomes untenable, regardless of his military strength. Oren nodded slowly. He knows this, Cale said. Yes, she said. Which is why he is on the border now, rather than waiting for the allies to arrive. He wants to move before the witnesses come. Cale looked at Conrad. Engage the border group, not aggressively. Hold them at the boundary and make it slow. Buy us 3 days. And if they push, then we push back, Cale said. But carefully. I do not want a war on my border 6 days after my return from the last one. Conrad went. That left the 3 of them in the library, and for a moment, nobody said anything, because the shape of the next 3 days was clear enough and uncomfortable enough that speaking about it plainly required a specific kind of courage. Ilara said, You should know something. Cale and Oren both looked at her. On the night of the gathering, she said, Seraphina's departure was not spontaneous. She sent a courier on the morning of the 4th day, before the gathering had even happened. She sent it to Gerald Vane. I saw it from the corridor window. I did not understand at the time what it meant, but the timing tells me she suspected something about me before the gathering. She may have known for longer than we think. Oren said, The question is what Gerald told Draven. Everything he knew, Ilara said, which was everything Seraphina knew, which means Draven knew about me before I was named aloud at the gathering. The gathering confirmed it, but the information was already moving. Cale said, How much does Seraphina know? Specifically, she knows I existed. She knows I was in this house. She knows the old man recognized me. Ilara paused. She knows her father opened the gates. The room was very quiet. She told you this, Cale said. She did not need to, Ilara said. The way she looked at me in that dining hall, the first night you returned, not the cruelty. I have seen casual cruelty. This was specific. She was looking at a problem. I thought I was reading too much into it. I was not reading too much into it. Cale stood up from his chair and moved to the window, and stood there with his back to the room, looking out at the courtyard. She watched the line of his back, and recognized it as the position of someone thinking hard enough that they needed to remove themselves from eye contact to do it fully. Then he turned around. "I need to know something," he said. She waited. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what are you? Not what do you plan to do? What do you want?" It was a specific enough question that it surprised her. She thought about it honestly, because he was looking at her with the kind of directness that dishonest answers bounced off of. "I want Draven to answer for what he did," she said. "Not just for my family, for everyone he has taken from since. He does not stop because someone protects me. He stops when the packs that are still silent because they are afraid decide there is less to fear from standing up than from staying quiet. And after that?" She looked at him. "I don't know," she said, and it was true. "I have spent 15 years thinking about surviving. I have not spent much time thinking about what comes after surviving." He nodded, as though this was the most reasonable answer she could have given. That night, the manor was on a quiet kind of alert, the kind that looks ordinary from the outside and feels like a held breath from the inside. Wolves moved at double their usual pace through the halls. The kitchen ran longer hours. The outer gates were manned through dark. Ilara slept badly and woke before dawn to the sound of something she placed, after a moment, as not a sound but a feeling, a shift in the air. She sat up in her narrow bed and held still and listened. The moon was down. The night was still. But somewhere, at the edge of what she could feel rather than hear, something was wrong. She was out of bed and dressed before she had fully articulated why, and she was moving down the corridor toward the east wing when she heard the shout from outside, close, sharp, the specific shout of a guard who has seen something he was not expecting. Then the smell of smoke. She ran. The east side of the manor was burning. Not the whole of it, a targeted section, near the old storeroom where the servants' entrance connected to the external wall. She could hear the chaos outside before she reached the window, wolves in transition, voices calling positions, the organized disorder of a force that had planned something and was now in the middle of executing it. They had come through the unpatrolled section, the one Lara had been trying to warn Conrad about since yesterday, the northeastern gap where the old outbuilding interrupted the sightline. She took the servants' stairs down at a run. On the second landing, she almost collided with Kale coming the other way, and he caught her arm without thinking about it and said, "This way." And the naturalness of the gesture, the total absence of hesitation in it, hit her somewhere beneath her practical attention. She followed him. The great hall was being used as a staging point. Conrad was directing wolves at speed, sending fighters to 3 separate exterior points. 2 of the visiting allies, not Aldrich Stone, who was still 2 days out, but a smaller group of 6, who had arrived quietly the evening before at Oren's old invitation, were already in position near the south wall. Kale said to Conrad, "The northeast gap." "Covered," Conrad said. 15 minutes ago, but they are already inside the wall." Inside the wall meant the outer courtyard, which meant the manor itself was the next thing they had to defend. Ilara said, "Where is Oren?" Conrad pointed. "Library." He would not move. She started that way. Kale said, "Ilara." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized as the expression of someone who has something important to say and not enough time to say it properly. "Stay near the inside," he said. "Do not go to the wall." "I know," she said. "I mean it." "I know," she said again, and she did. She was not a fighter in the trained sense, not with conventional weapons or conventional technique. She was something else, and something else was not useful in a breach defense. Not yet, not tonight. "Go," she said. "I'll find Oren." He went. She reached the library in under 2 minutes and found Oren exactly where Conrad had said, at his desk, surrounded by his papers and his maps and his 15 years of careful documentation, and he was perfectly calm in the way of someone who has already decided what he is willing to risk for what matters. "We need to move you," she said. "No," he said pleasantly. "Oren. These documents need to survive tonight regardless of what else does or does not survive," he said. "And I am the only one who knows exactly what they contain and where to find it quickly." He looked at her over the papers. "So I will stay here, and you will make sure no Bloodfang wolf makes it to this room." She looked at him. She thought about arguing. She decided not to waste the time. "Is there anything in these papers that would end this tonight?" she said. If Draven were standing in front of the right witnesses, Oren pulled a leather-bound file from beneath a stack of correspondence and held it out. Everything. The gate records, the vein connection, 3 signed testimonies from witnesses who survived the attack and agreed to go on record. He paused. "I have been building this file for 12 years. She took it. She heard something outside the library door. Not panic. A specific sound. The sound of movement that was too controlled to be one of her own wolves. Too contained. Too deliberate. The door opened. The man who stepped through was not someone she had ever seen before, but she knew who he was immediately, with the certainty that comes from spending 15 years thinking about a person's shape before you ever meet them in person. He was large, dark-haired, with old power in his face, the look of someone who has done something irreversible and made peace with it a long time ago. Alpha Draven looked at her with an expression that was almost curious. "You look like your mother," he said. Alara stood between him and Oren and held the file against her chest and looked at him. "You should have stayed hidden," he said. "Yes," she said. "Probably." And then Cale Blackwood came through the door behind Draven, moving faster than she had expected, from the direction she had not expected, and the look on Cale's face was not the look of someone who was too late. He was not too late. The thing about Draven was that he was very good. He was very good, and he had not survived this long by being careless. And even surprised, even caught between 2 points, he moved like a man who had been in worse situations and come out of them intact. He was out of the narrow doorway before Cale could close the distance, and he was in the corridor with his back to the wall and his options recalculated, all of this within the space of seconds. And Alara pressed back against Oren's desk and understood that the next few moments would decide a great many things. She also understood that she had something Draven did not. She had the file. Not as a weapon, as the thing he had spent 15 years trying to prevent from existing in any accessible form. The documented truth of what he had done, in whose hands, with whose assistance. If the file survived and she survived and there were witnesses, then tonight could end not with a battle, but with something that could not be undone by winning the next battle. She said, "Oren, go out through the window onto the south roof. Wait there." Oren said, "I am not going to." "Oren," she looked at him directly. "Please." He went. Cale and Draven were in the corridor, and Alara followed to the doorway and stood in it and watched. She would not pretend she was a match for a trained alpha in a physical confrontation. She was not, but she was not helpless either, and she had one thing she had not yet used tonight. Draven was larger than Cale. He was older, more experienced, heavier in his power in the specific way of men who have been using it unchallenged for a long time. But Cale was faster than Alara had expected him to be, and he was fresh where Draven had been moving through a manor break-in for the last hour, and the gap between them was not as wide as Draven had probably calculated. She watched them and held the file and thought. What she needed was witnesses. What she needed was for the right people to see the right things. She thought about the 6 Saltwood wolves who had arrived yesterday. She thought about Conrad, who was at the south wall. She thought about the 2 remaining border patrol groups, who were somewhere in the exterior courtyard. She thought about Aldrich Stone, who was 2 days out. 2 days was too long. But what she had right now was enough if she used it correctly. She raised her voice. Not the command voice. Not yet. Just her voice, pitched to carry. "There are witnesses in this house who can hear me," she called into the corridor. Over the struggle between the 2 men. "Anyone who is neutral and present, come to the east corridor, now." She did not know who would come. She did not know if it would be enough. She was using the only thing she had, which was the file in her hands and the truth it contained, and she was trusting that there were people in and around this manor tonight who were not certain whose side they were on yet, and who would make a different choice given a different set of information. 2 of the Saltwood wolves appeared at the end of the corridor within 90 seconds. Then one of the Black Moon elders who had been in the manor for the gathering and had not yet returned home. Then another wolf she did not recognize, young, possibly Bloodfang, possibly one of the ones who had followed Draven not out of loyalty, but out of the kind of obligation that comes from not knowing there was another option. She opened the file. She spoke. She did not speak loudly. She did not perform it. She said, in the plain, clear language she had been using all her life to communicate things that mattered. What was in the documentation? What Oren had assembled? What had happened 15 years ago? By whose hands? At whose agreement? And what had been built on top of it since? She said it in the same tone she had used to address Elder Oren in the library, and to address Kale at the table, the tone of someone who is telling the truth and does not need to decorate it. She was still speaking when Kale brought Draven to the ground. Not permanently. Draven was not finished, and the struggle was not clean, and there was a moment where it went wrong enough that Alara's heart moved hard in her chest and she nearly used the command voice without deciding to. But Conrad arrived from the south hallway in that moment with 4 of his best, and the calculation changed, and Draven looked at the assembled faces in the corridor with the look of a man who is very good at reading when a room has shifted entirely against him. He was contained. Not destroyed, not yet, but contained, and surrounded, and in a corridor full of witnesses. He looked at Alara. She looked back at him without flinching. "The testimony that is in this file," she said to him directly, "will go to every pack leader I can reach within the next 10 days. Whatever you do to me tonight does not change that. Oren is outside this manor right now. Conrad has copies of the land records. Elder Mira of the Greymount Council has been holding a sealed letter from me since yesterday morning." She paused. "You cannot undo what has already been done." The corridor was very quiet. Draven said nothing. It was not surrender. She knew that. It was the silence of a man recalculating, which was its own kind of answer. The night ended slowly, the way long nights do, in pieces and stages rather than all at once. Draven's wolves, most of them, pulled back from the manor walls when Conrad's signal reached the border patrol. 3 of the Bloodfang wolves inside the wall were contained and held without serious injury to either side. The fire at the east storeroom was put out before it reached the main structure. By dawn, the courtyard was quiet. By mid-morning, Oren was back at his desk, slightly windblown from his time on the south roof, but otherwise entirely himself, cataloging the documents that had survived the night and noting which ones needed to be copied and distributed immediately. Conrad sat down at the kitchen table and drank 2 cups of strong tea and said nothing to anyone for 20 minutes, which Alara recognized as his version of recovery. Aldrich Stone arrived a day and a half early with 80 wolves, which turned out not to be necessary for combat, but to be exactly what was needed for the peace that followed it. He was a large, steady man with a direct manner and old enough to have known the Moonshadow Court before the attack. And when he saw Ilara, he looked at her for a long moment and then inclined his head with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with the command voice and everything to do with choice. Marin Ellis arrived the following day. The formal proceedings that stripped Draven of his contested territorial claims and placed the evidence of the Vane family's involvement before an assembled council of pack leaders took 3 weeks to organize and 2 days to conduct. Gerald Vane, when the evidence was presented, did not deny it. He was an old man by then, and perhaps the long weight of carrying it had become heavier than the value of continuing to carry it. He spoke in a flat, careful voice, and the room was very quiet throughout, and afterward he and Serafina and 3 other members of their household were stripped of their pack standing and escorted from the territory. Draven was a more complicated matter. He could not be destroyed by council proceeding alone, and everyone in the room understood this, because he was still powerful and still had allies, and the world was not a place where truth alone was sufficient to end someone who had built much on its opposite. But the council's formal finding was recorded and distributed, and the allied packs who had come to Black Moon Manor went home carrying it, and the silence that had surrounded Draven for 15 years, the silence of packs that were afraid to speak clearly, began to develop gaps in it. It would be a long work. Alara knew this. She had always known this. There was no single moment of victory that ended it. There was only the next right action, and the one after that, and the deliberate long business of making the world different from how she had found it. She was standing in the courtyard on the morning after the council proceedings ended, in the early light, the kind that makes everything look clean and unwritten on, when Kale came and stood beside her. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking, rather than just calculating. "The pack leaders are asking," he said, "what your intentions are, formally." She looked at the morning light on the manor walls. "I know," she said. Aldrich Stone has suggested the old Moonshadow estate could be reclaimed as a seat for the royal bloodline. I know, she said. He mentioned it. A pause. And? Cale said. She turned and looked at him. He was looking back with the same direct, unperformed attention he always used, and she was no longer managing her response to it with the careful structure she had maintained for 3 years, because she had run out of walls to put between herself and things that were simply true. I don't know yet, she said honestly. There are things I want to finish here first. The families who helped, the servants who were kind. She paused. There are people in this manor who worked alongside me for 3 years and were decent to me on days when decent was not the expected behavior. I would like to do something useful with whatever standing I am now supposed to have before I go anywhere. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I owe you more than an apology. She looked at him. My pack saw you every day for 3 years, he said. They spoke to you like you were furniture. Some of them struck you. All of them ignored you. And I was not here, which is an explanation, but not a reason. He held her gaze steadily. I would like to make that right, if you will let me. Not as a political arrangement, not because of what your title is, because it is the right thing to do, and because I have been thinking about almost nothing else for 3 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. You kneeled, she said, on the night of the gathering. I did, he said. And again, in the library, when you offered the pack. She had thought about this. She had thought about it more than she wanted to admit. You kneeled both times, because you chose to, not because the command voice was in effect. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then stand beside me, she said. Don't kneel to me. I have had enough of people kneeling. I spent 3 years on my knees in this house, and I never wanted anyone else on theirs. Stand beside me. That is what I want. He held her gaze for a moment. Then the thing that had been contained behind his eyes, the thing that was not performance, and not calculation, but simply the raw fact of what he felt, moved across his face in a way she suspected he was not entirely aware of. Yes, he said. The morning light was very bright on the courtyard stones. She turned her face toward it and breathed, slowly, all the way in, all the way out. Marta came out of the manor behind them a few minutes later, with the expression of a woman who had survived too many changes in 1 month to be surprised by anything anymore, and set 2 cups of tea on the courtyard bench, and looked at neither of them directly, and went back inside. Ilara picked up one of the cups. She thought, going to need the morning tea today. There were letters to write, and allies to thank, and 3 years of small wrongs to begin addressing, and the enormous complicated work of deciding what the Moonshadow bloodline meant going forward, in a world that had grown to believe it was gone. There were pack leaders to meet, and agreements to negotiate, and a man named Draven who was not finished yet, and would require watching for a long time to come. There was Gerald Vane's family to account for formally, and Seraphina's role to investigate fully, and Oren's 12 years of documentation to put in front of the right people in the right order. There was all of that, and it was real, and it was a great deal. But the morning light was on the courtyard, and the tea was warm in her hands, and she was standing in the open air, without pressing anything down, without hiding anything, without making herself small to stay safe, in a house that had never been meant to hold her. She had been a maid in this house for 3 years. She had cleaned its floors and carried its water, and kept its secrets, and made herself invisible, while the world it belonged to looked straight through her. She thought of every servant who had done the same, every quiet person in every grand house who carried the day forward without credit or recognition, who shaped the world they lived in by the steadiness of their hands and the smallness of their profile, and the discipline of their endurance. There was a particular kind of strength in that. She had worn it, and she knew its weight. She would not forget it. Whatever she became next, in whatever formal shape the bloodline took in the world, she would carry the knowing of that weight forward. She would carry the knowledge of what it felt like to be looked through, and she would let it make her better at the only thing that mattered, which was seeing people clearly. She finished the tea. She went back inside. There was work to do, and she was good at work, and the day was starting. The people who had called her just a maid were already fading into the past, like a dream you remember less the further you move from sleep. The world would tell a different story from here, not an easy story, not a finished one, but a true one, and it was hers to write.